Hello, old friends. This is Mike Dawson, and I welcome you to my Dreamers2Makers podcast, where I interview curious people that do extraordinary things. As I launch the second season of the Dreamers2Makers program, I am excited to present today's guest, film director and documentary producer, Stephen Slater. He is the archive producer for the 2019 documentary Apollo 11. This award-winning film has appeared on the world stage as commemorations are taking place to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 space expedition. The documentary was directed by Todd Douglas Miller and has already become a hit internationally. I have invited my friend and colleague Brandon Fibbs to interview Stephen Slater today. Fibbs is best known for his work as researcher for Cosmos, a Spacetime Odyssey, and as associate producer for The Story of God with Morgan Freeman. He is also one of the masterminds behind one of my favorite new podcasts, Wikisurfer.
Last series on Wikisurfer, Brandon and I explored the awesome span of the Amazon River. The Earth must have been baking. You must have been quite a warm little river, Brandon. I bet it feels nice.
Oh, yeah. Oh, this feels great. I recommend this temperature if you ever decide to become a river.
Inventoried the world's most astonishing mummies.
In December of 1976, the television show The $6 Million Man with Lee Majors was filming at the amusement park when a prop man moved what he thought was a wax mannequin hanging from the gallows. That's when the mannequin's arm broke off, exposing a human bone and muscle tissue.
Sampled the history of recorded sound.
Thousands of these cylinder recordings were sold to the public. Many of the artists and tunes recorded are not something we'd recognize today, even though some of them are quite good.
Witnessed the destructive wrath of a volcano.
When the national spotlight turned to the lead-up of the eruption of Mount St. Helens, Harry R. Truman became something of a minor celebrity. He gave interviews to local and national reporters, indicating that he refused to leave his home. Quote,
"If the mountain goes, I'm going with it. That mountain's part of Truman, and Truman's part of that mountain."
Peered inside our potty mouths.
Shakespeare's plays were edited to remove anything that might offend women or children.
Away, you starveling! You eel skin! You dried neat's tongue! You bull's pizzle!
And entrenched ourselves on the battlefields of World War II.
The last of the Japanese forces attacked in one of the largest banzai charges of the Pacific Campaign. The Japanese penetrated all the way through and into the rear of the American force, engaging in close quarter and hand-to-hand combat with swords. This summer, Kyle and I will be embarking on a new series of thrilling and illuminating adventures. We'll be taking a trek into outer space, communing with Aztec gods, stand at ground zero for one of history's largest explosions, and examine the moment when life first conquered the skies.
While there are some creative changes ahead, we promise Wikisurfer will continue to be an experiment in podcast storytelling and your source for the most wonderful, weirdest, and interesting stories Wikipedia has to offer.
We are busy writing the new series of Wikisurfer right now. If you haven't already, be sure to check out Series 1 and hear what all the fuss is about. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, or visit us at www.wikisurferpodcast.com.
Brandon, thanks for sitting in to interview my guest, Stephen Slater. I appreciate you working this into your schedule. How's it been going?
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is quite the honor. I can't wait to talk to this guy, and I am doing well. Thank you very much.
Let's listen in on your great interview with Stephen Slater, who was the archive producer for the great documentary film Apollo 11. And then maybe we can talk a little bit after the interview's wrapped up here, and we can talk about what we heard.
Sounds fantastic.
Cool.
All right. Well, Stephen, I think before we go anywhere, before I ask you any questions, first I have to make a declaration or two, and that is to say, congratulations, because Apollo 11 is gobsmackingly amazing. It was such an amazing film, and I just wanted to say thank you for having such a crucial and critical part in it.
That's very kind of you. No, thanks. I think we're kind of all a bit overwhelmed by the reaction to it, as we sort of used to sitting in dark rooms, and then you see the reaction. It's amazing. Yeah, very humbling.
Well, I confess, it's one of those things I wrote on Facebook after I walked out of the theater, and I kind of sat in my car for like 20 minutes and kind of like wrote a little review before I even turned the key to drive home. And I think one of the things that shocked me so much about it is you think there's not a new way to tell this story. You are so familiar with the story. You know every little in and out. You know every crevice of it. And then you see something like this, which has so much new footage and spectacular footage. I mean, I was thinking, was this shot yesterday in 4K? I mean, this is lavishly beautiful. And I found myself thinking, I know every touchstone of the narrative progression of this story, and yet it is told with images that are so different than I'm used to that it feels fresh and open-ended. And it's just, if you haven't seen it, listeners, you absolutely have to go see it as soon as you can. If it's still playing at a theater on a large screen near you, you must go see this movie.
Yes, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of opportunities to see this as the anniversary comes up. But no, I completely agree. I mean, I felt the same way when I saw. You're talking about the 70mm footage, which was basically newly discovered for this production. And I remember sitting in the Air and Space Museum in DC in December 2017. We had a test screening, and that was the first time I'd seen. It was actually the suiting up reels of the astronauts, and I say everyone's jaw was on the floor who hadn't seen it. Obviously, they'd seen it in the lab when they were transferring the film, but it was I kind of know the feeling.
Well, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, so we will get to the film and we will get to your role in it, and we'll get to that footage here in a moment. But first, I kind of wanted to, since origin stories are all the rage these days, I'm kind of curious, what's your origin story? Where were you born and where did you grow up?
Yeah, well, I live in Sheffield in England, which is kind of a former industrial city in the north of England. Although I was actually born just south of London, but I've lived here pretty much my whole life, and grew up in the Peak District, which is the biggest national park actually in England. So very rural sort of background. But if you're talking about my interest in space, I think it probably began in about early 90s as a child, when I just was very interested in planets and space exploration. And then I saw Apollo 13, the movie with Ron Howard movie with Tom Hanks, starring Tom Hanks, in 1995 at the cinema. And I think that has a lot to answer for in terms of me being interested in Apollo and the moon, the manned moon landings. And
now, I understand your dad was a presenter for the BBC, correct?
Well, he still is. He was a BBC sports reporter. BBC specialising in football, but he also covered Formula One, auto racing, as you call it in the US, cycling, kind of big sort of broad spectrum of sports. But he's still working, just not maybe quite as much as he used to. But he was at the Winter Olympics last year, things like that. So yeah, he's ticking along.
I'm one of those weird people who I'm not a huge sports fan, but the one codicil to that is the Olympics. I will watch every minute I can clap my eyes on during the Olympics. I have been known to get like 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night during the entire run of the Olympics, just record everything and just watch obsessively. So I understand that. I appreciate your dad's work in that kind of field.
Yes, it's always a special thing, the Olympics. Yeah, for sure.
So you mentioned that, you kind of grew up, you saw Apollo 13, that was like some inspiration, stuff like that. Would you qualify those sorts of things, just watching shuttle launches, movies like that, as sort of the catalyst that kind of ignited a love for space in you? And did you know at a young age that, like, hey, I want to do something with this topic in terms of a career, or was that something that you kind of stumbled on much later?
Well, there's two things. There's kind of two elements. There's the interest in space, and then there's also the kind of filmmaking aspect. And I think possibly the space interest had kind of receded a bit. I went to college actually here in Sheffield in 2004 and 2005, and it was around that time. I mean, I've been shooting and editing films at home since I was 13 or 14. Probably a lot of the time when I should have been doing my schoolwork. And then, so that just got me very interested in creating films, editing, and then particularly documentaries. And when I was at college, was around the time when the Huygens space probe landed on Saturn's largest moon, Titan. So this was, it was launched in 1997 with the Cassini Millercraft. This was a massive international unmanned space mission to explore Saturn. And it carried with it a small lander which parachuted through Titan's atmosphere and landed and sent back pictures. So I got so hooked on that when I was at school. When I was at college in Sheffield. And I remember vividly, because I was actually talking about this recently, because I actually been back there recently because they want me to be an ambassador for the college, which is weird because I never considered myself a kind of a model student really. But I vividly remember sitting and watching a live stream of this landing on the computers in the library there. And this was like a Windows Media sort of streaming. So way before, this was before YouTube.
I remember the days.
Before Facebook, before Twitter, anything like that. And I just watched as the scientists were sort of reacting to this happening. And there was this British guy called John Czarnecki who was talking about how they'd spent 17 years building this space probe and it was all this, it basically all came down to that one day in January 2005. Was it going to survive? And were we going to get any data for all these years of efforts? And I thought, I want to tell that story. That's a great story. And so a very long story short is that 6 years later, that film ended up on the BBC, which I basically self-financed, edited. And I told that story, interviewing those scientists and retelling that story using the archive from, because obviously the thing about archive, as with Apollo 11, I wasn't there. None of us were there who were on the team. We need to tell the story using material that existed already, or by recollections of people who were involved, or a combination of the two. And there you have documentary filmmaking, I think. But yeah.
That's incredible. I had no idea that you had kind of like self-financed it and then the BBC had shown it. So I assume you're talking about Destination Titan, right? The documentary?
Yes, I am, yeah. So that was, that's the first big, I'd say, space-related. Well, I'd say it's probably the thing I'm still probably most proud of, having, it was kind of my baby, that, and then to see that go on the BBC. But more importantly, I think it really inspired a love of archive and finding all the best archive. And I think that's kind of why we are where we are today in terms of my career choices or the projects I've worked on since then. Because that's 8 years ago now. So yeah, it's I can't.
Yeah. Yeah, judging by your IMDb profile, you've always been interested in space, all the kind of things. But what kind of struck me is all the different roles you've kind of played across your career. So like, when you're at a party and someone says, "Hey, Stephen, what do you do?" Like, what do you say? Are you a researcher? Are you a research producer? Are you an archive producer? You're an editor? You're a director? Like, you've kind of played in all the spaces. What do you consider yourself? What is your kind of, calling, for lack of a better word?
I'm very much a kind of that I can do everything, and I'm a bit of a control freak. I like to be able to do everything, but I wouldn't have said that filming or a lighting cameraman or something very specialist like that would be my thing. I'd probably get someone to do that with me, like on Destination Titan. I had someone who filmed those interviews with me, which is pretty much the only thing I didn't do on the film. But because I need to concentrate on doing the interviews, although I could have filmed the interviews if I'd wanted to, it just might not have been quite as good because I'm not as trained in that field.
Sure.
What would people say? What would I say to someone at a party now? Is I'd say I'd specialize as an archive producer because, and I don't think it's a very well defined role. It's
Please give us that. What is an archive producer?
Well, I'd say it's basically a glorified, another way of saying archive researcher, but probably in a kind of a more senior level, in that I'm making more creative suggestions with that material. It's not just a case of me passing it over to the director and then letting him then do all the make all the decisions. I'm intimately involved normally with the not always, but with the filmmaking process and certain decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also, in my case, I just always make it a mission to sort of understand everything I can about a particular subject and just go to the sort of nth degree to try and uncover as many stones as I can. Because I just feel like there's so much. It's something that's been in the news a lot here in the UK recently because of criminal proceedings. But I worked on a documentary about the Hillsborough football disaster, which actually happened in my hometown of Sheffield. And that was, incredibly different from working on something about the space program, and very harrowing in many ways because it was, it involved looking at a lot of quite distressing material and a lot of, for example, TV coverage. If I could just backtrack a bit, it was a stadium disaster where 96 Liverpool football fans were crushed to death.
I remember that.
It was the FA Cup semi-final. I was only 2 years old at the time. But interestingly, it was the week that we as a family moved to the area. And a very good friend of ours was actually the secretary of Sheffield Wednesday Football Club at the time, and which is Hillsborough is the stadium of Sheffield Wednesday. So, and with my dad being a football reporter, it's a story that's very, very close to home in many ways. And so I eventually end up working on this film, which you're transported back to that day. And I still remember vividly sitting in an edit suite, looking at all the match coverage from that day. Basically, there's isolated cameras from all around the ground that were recorded in a van, basically, and just the horror of it and the sounds and everything just stuck with me for a long time. But that's another example of where I just got completely immersed in trying to understand everything I could about what happened on that day and what the visual record would be, researching transcripts, police interviews, testimony of people who were there to try and understand what material existed. And obviously there are a lot of legal issues around that as well, which would probably take 10 more podcasts to go into. So I'll leave it there. But I don't actually know if that answered your question about me being an archive.
No, it did. It did. And I'm kind of curious, what is, for our listeners, what is a sort of like average day in a life for you when you're an archive producer? What does that mean? What's the kind of like nitty gritty? If we were to follow you around for a day with our own cameras, what would we see?
A lot of looking at computer screens. I mean, a lot of the research, because of current technology, can happen online. But the mistake that I think a lot of people can fall into is that they seem to think that everything is now available on YouTube or on the internet, and actually that's just the kind of surface layer, or it might be just material which has been broadcast or which is more easily available that someone has then put on YouTube. If you start to dig deeply, then you can find all kinds of things, and that can involve going to museums, going to libraries, going to also places where you can just access different research databases. So I'm a very hands-on kind of researcher, in that I like to do all the research myself. I don't really like relying on other people to do that research. So, just because I have like ways I like doing things. So I'm sure you're the same in many ways. But, yeah.
I think we all are. There are times, however, where you realize that the scope of the project is so overwhelming that you have no choice but to rely on others. And that's when it's important to surround yourself with the best people possible.
Yes. I mean, if we talk about, I know we're not talking specifically about Apollo 11 here, but Apollo 11 is an example of where it needs, you need to master that one particular archive really well, I think, which is the NASA archive. And that's something I've made I'd say my life's mission, but it's not quite like that. But I've, spent several years trying to get to the bottom of that. Whereas other productions might, like the Hillsborough thing, a lot of that was BBC material, because the BBC were at the match filming. But I did another film about the life of George Best, who was an English soccer player, and the film covered his whole life. So in that case, you could be talking about 100 different archive sources. So it's a very different kind of project, and you have to work out always where's likely to be the most fruitful place to search, and then maybe put a lot of your eggs in that basket. And then you can dig up some good stuff, because obviously there's not going to be time to do that everywhere for every ability, especially with someone was filmed as much as George Best. I mean, I imagine how much archive must exist.
So how did you become involved in Apollo 11? How did a Brit get involved in, obviously, the space program is, particularly even Apollo 11, is something that is beloved globally. So I don't mean it in any sort of derogatory way whatsoever. But like, how did the filmmakers reach out to you and say, hey, come on this project, we're going to make something special? How did you get involved in that?
Back in about 2010, I began this, which was just before Destination Titan was finished and aired. I got involved with trying to synchronize audio that had been recorded on the Apollo 11 air to ground. So this is what you heard during the mission, the capsule communicator in Houston talking to the crew. Tranquility Base, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. There's one guy in mission control whose job it was to speak to the crew, and so that's the audio you heard. So I'd always looked at this mission control footage and thought, well, I actually want to see these guys speaking. Why is it I never see that? And the answer is, as I was soon to learn, is because all that footage was recorded completely without sound. It was shot on 16mm cameras that these guys were just literally wandering around, getting a quick shot here, then shooting a screen, shooting a clock, and then they'd probably go for a cigarette break and come back 10 minutes later. So you just had this jumbled mess of film footage from Apollo 11, and I wanted to sort of try and work out when it was shot and then synchronize the audio. And I did all of that for the Apollo 11 descent and landing in around 2010, and there was some articles about it at the time, and I think probably that was the first time I was working with the Apollo archive in that kind of specific way. And then I went on to work on a documentary all about Gene Cernan, who was the last man to walk on the moon. This was a feature-length documentary that premiered in 2014. So it was his life story. And again, that relied on primarily the NASA archive. And so I used those skills that I developed through doing that sinking project and through Destination Titan to tell his story. And that film was released, I think, reasonably well acclaimed, although it's a while since I've seen it. But then I kind of, probably as a result of me working on these projects, I became just known as the person to sort of go to, maybe when it came to these big sort of space documentaries. And then I'd also accumulated a lot of my own archive. I say my own archive, copies of the NASA archive. I have copies of a very large collection of that, and a lot of it's in high definition. And so it's because of how hard it is for people to get material from NASA, I end up getting a lot of people just coming to me wanting access to material and wanting footage. So it's not like they particularly need my time. It's more that they need access to the footage. So in 2016, I was introduced to Todd Douglas Miller from Statement Pictures, who went on to direct the Apollo 11 documentary. And what Todd was trying to do at that stage was they had been commissioned to do a short documentary about Apollo 17. And the idea was to tell the story of Apollo 17 just using the archive. So no modern day interviews with Gene Cernan, who was still alive at the time, or Jack Schmitt, or Ron Evans, the other crew member, died in 1990. But it was just to tell it using the film they shot on the mission and on the ground. And I guess he'd been tipped off that I had a large collection of that. And so we started working together on that film in 2016. I sent them everything I had on Apollo 17. At the time, it was one of these things where, it's just kind of another inquiry. And then I think it was in the spring of that year, I got sent a rough cut of the film to give notes. And I suddenly realized, wow, these guys really know what they're doing. The music was perfect, the editing, the way everything was structured. It's just this kind of spider sense you get when you can see that someone gets it. And I was, and then I flew to the Hamptons Film Festival at the end of that year for the premiere. And it looked amazing on the big screen. And so that was the start of that relationship. That film is available now on YouTube. It's called The Last Steps. It's on the Great Big Story channel, which is a channel run by CNN for short films that they funded. And then Apollo 11 came off the back of that. But I don't know. So that's probably too much detail there. I don't know. Do you need me to?
No, not at all. So you were previously involved with Todd and his crew and stuff like that. So it made sense then when they went to tackle Apollo 11, which is even more drowning in research and stuff like that. That made a lot of sense then that they're like, you're still our guy.
Yeah, well, so we done The Last Step. I thought that The Last Steps was brilliant. It was one of the best projects I'd worked on. It was kind of a level above some of the things I'm used to, where I've helped out with things. And then so I said to Todd, because I knew that this anniversary was coming up, the 50th anniversary. Well, look, I've done all this work to sync up all this mission control audio for Apollo 11, and I've got all this stuff on hard drives. I think there's the possibility that we could do something that would be different for the 50th anniversary using that, and then also using. But all we were thinking at that stage is, let's get all the best copies of everything out there that exists. That we already know about, but let's make it in a style like The Last Steps, and just in a way that retells that mission in an all archive way, like The Last Steps. And I didn't think of it as being, an IMAX movie. I thought of this as a kind of a short film, maybe a 30-minute film, but that would just do a really good job of summarizing that mission and maybe doing it in a new way. And I thought that Todd was the right person to do it. So we talked about it. I think quickly CNN came on board to the idea. And then a few months into the project, after we'd sort of scoped out what existed, then the 70mm material landed in our lap, and it just became a different proposition. But
yeah, so for our listeners who are not aware or who have not seen the film, there is no narrator. There are no interviews. Everything is in situ archive material. So Stephen's job, I would have to assume, sir, was incredibly important because you have to be able to tell the story every step to get from this occurrence to that occurrence.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to tell that only with audio and video that you can that's available. And so for me, when I'm watching the film, one of the thoughts I had was you had the hardest job because you, in essence, were the narrator. You, in essence, were the guy being interviewed, but it was not with people you were speaking to. It was archive material you were finding.
Well, yes. I mean, really, the main thing we're talking about here is the mission control footage. Now, as I said, if we just take a step back, what I'd done in 2010 was mainly restricted to the power descent and landing, and that covered a kind of couple of hour long million. So now what we were looking to do was to do that for the entire Apollo 11 mission. So that's the 8/9 days of that flight. And yeah, I'm basically looking at all this archive and thinking, when did this happen during the mission, primarily with the mission control material, which we can come on to later. And a lot of that is dictated by the audio and being able to place the audio in the right place and sync it with the footage. So then that gives us a timeline where we have eight days worth of material.
As I understand it, you had, I've read, 11,000 hours of mission control audio. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. In fact, there's 18,000 hours that have been recorded, that have been transferred for the Apollo program, but 11,000 was related to Apollo 11.
That is extraordinary. So you are trying to match audio to video that, like you said, was shot randomly by people between cigarette breaks and whatnot, and you can only generally do if you just happen to also catch some sort of time counter or a clock or something like that in the background. It sounds, forgive me for saying so, tremendously tedious. Is this the kind of thing that you kind of thrive on? Is it not tedious to you because it's just kind of how you are built? Or is it one of those things where every moment is agonizing, but the ecstasy that comes when you actually do get a match is worth it?
Yes, I think you've summarized it quite well there. Although I've never found it hugely tedious because you learn so much from just listening to it, and every baby step you take, you find out a bit more about the mission. So it's sometimes you could spend like 3 or 4 days just doing one clip, and it sounds like animation. It's that kind of chore. But sometimes things came quicker than you might imagine. It's like it's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle in that once you have one bit working, then that can lead you on to solving another problem elsewhere. So it's fun. I maybe not to everyone, but it's and I like the idea that once it's done, it's kind of done forever. So it's done for posterity in a way. It's like that.
Sure.
That problem's now solved forever. Although where people are going to find it, or I'm not sure. But actually, I do know where they're going to find it. But that's we can come on to that. But
well, and that's a good point. Like, the work you did may have made the film Apollo 11 amazing, but it is also did a lot of extraordinary work for NASA. I'm sure if I was working at NASA history and stuff like that, those guys must be delighted and overwhelmed with the work you did.
I wouldn't. Don't bank on that. NASA's you think about NASA is they're a very forward-looking agency, and I've always found. Don't be under any illusions that they would always sort of throw open their doors and say, "Come in and find this stuff." I think I've probably annoyed a lot of people at NASA over the years just by my sort of persistence in trying to find the best stuff. And no, absolutely, I'm sure that they do appreciate it, and particularly Bill Barry and the NASA HQ team in Washington. I know how much they like the film and appreciate the work, but they are coming at it from a different perspective to me. They have new spacecraft to build. They have new goals to achieve. And I don't know. I think ultimately it would be nice if this material, well, the raw material is going to the National Archives, but the synced material, I hope will have a kind of permanent place that's not on some hard drive in Sheffield, ultimately. But one of my colleagues, Ben Feist, is actually building who was the sort of, we haven't really talked about him, but he is a software developer from Canada, from Toronto, and he took this 11,000 hours worth of audio because, like, it's the kind of audio equivalent of the mission control footage in that it had just sort of been dumped onto a hard drive, and it had a lot of technical problems with it. The audio suffered from wow and flutter, which I know they're quite technical terms, but basically everyone sounded worried. all these controllers. So if I haven't really introduced the concept of the 30 track. Basically, there was 60 think of it as 60 channels worth of audio throughout the entire mission. All of those guys in mission control have headsets on, so each of those channels effectively gives you access to their headset. But before Stephen Slater can apply the attempt to sort of to sync this material with the film footage, we first of all have to know when they're saying it in the mission. So Ben did this absolutely unbelievable, genius job of correcting all these deficiencies with the audio, and then effectively making it's almost like think of it as a Beatles multi-track session of the whole Apollo mission, or a Pro Tools project, so that I can literally go in there and go to any time in the mission with the mission clock as a reference and say, well, okay, what's happening on that channel at 102 hours into the mission? And then I will get 60 channels of audio, and I can solo each of those channels, and then I can get some film footage and think, well, and try that audio to see if it works against a guy talking. So
that is amazing.
Ben's a huge part of why we've been able to do that.
This is a collaborative filmmaking, television, documentaries is an art form that is more than any other, I think, a collaborative process. We have our tour theory, basically lends us to believe that, the director is this end all and be all of a creative project, when in reality, it's hundreds of different people working their butts off to create something epic. And if one of them, part of the daisy chain falls, the entire thing collapses. And you guys, more than I think than even most, are a perfect example of just the best, most passionate people all coming at things and just layering your work on top of each other and producing something truly amazing. We should also mention, by the way, to the listeners who aren't aware of it, but Ben Feist's sister, is the pop singer Feist, the excellent singer.
Yeah, and I had no idea how famous she was, and I met her at Sundance. She came to Sundance. She actually did a gig at Sundance when we were there, and she was great and such a lovely person. But I had no idea of this other life of sort of pop stardom. So yeah.
I think a lot of us discovered her. She did a number of Apple commercials several years back, and I think that's where a lot of the world was was woke to her awesome music.
But what was really great was that she went on stage at Sundance in Park City and said, actually, I'm not here for me. I'm here for my brother. He's done this. He's part of the Apollo 11 team, and gave him a big shout out. And I think that it's great that Ben Feist is getting the recognition that he deserves.
Absolutely. Now, were you involved with the discovery of the unreleased 70mm footage?
Well, I was. That's a big story in itself. It's yes, in the sense that I'd got to know the guys at the National Archive, in particular a gentleman by the name of Dan Rooney, who's just the most the dream kind of guy you'd want to work with at an archive, who really is really passionate about the material, understands the history, and understands what's required from a technical point of view in the modern world, I'd say. So we got to know him, and we were discussing the 16 and 35 mil stuff, which we knew already existed, because even before the 70 mil material came on the scene, we still had very high aspirations in terms of quality for this film. So that meant when it comes to motion picture film, in every instance, we want to be able to scan the original reels. So that's like the reels that were in the camera. In the case of, let's say, the mission control footage, it's shot on something called reversal film, Ektachrome, which it's not negative. It's the film that's in the camera is the original and is processed. So I don't know quite how technical your audience is, but it's if you can imagine an old slide, it's a bit like that, or a Polaroid photograph even. So
Gotcha. Okay.
So then once that reel is copied, then it loses a lot of generations, and then that's why you end up with this muddy stuff, which has been seen in countless of them.
Every copy loses integrity. Yeah.
So it's a huge research process in itself to identify where the original reels ended up. And so we've been working with Dan to try and identify, well, do you have all this Apollo 11 original material? And we would arrange to have the film inspected, so that because they can tell from the key codes and etc. whether it is the original. And then as you would expect with something as big as the Apollo program, multiple generations of these reels have been made to give to news media and whatnot. And so you had the same footage appearing on multiple different reels. And it was a case of working out where is the original, because that's what we want to scan. We don't want to scan copies. We need to scan the originals with the best technology available. And then, so we've been in a dialogue with them about doing these new scans. And he said, well, I'll get back to you about kind of the project as a whole. We didn't hear anything for a few weeks. And then it was the 10th of May, 2017. This email came into my inbox from Dan. It was addressed to me and Todd and Tom, who's the producer. And it had all these bullet points saying how they could help us with the film, what different collections they had available for Apollo 11, what they've identified. And then we got to this line that said, we found what we think are 165 reels of 65 millimeter film. And we're not really sure exactly what it is, but over a third of them are identified as being related to Apollo 11, the suiting up, the launch, recovery activities, all this kind of thing. And it was just like, what?
I want to be a fly on the wall of you guys' brains when you read that.
Well, it was
because because we've all seen that. That's kind of what I was saying in the beginning. We are so familiar with this footage. We've seen so much of the same footage over and over again because that's all that exists. And then all of a sudden now it's not all that exists. You find new footage, and oh, by the way, it's not just some like random 16 millimeter or something. It was shot in like the same aspect ratio that we shot Lawrence of Arabia.
Yes, and I mean, I know it would have been great to be a fly on the wall. I'm sure when I got that, because I distinctly remember that I would almost always, with Todd, the director, we would have prearranged Skype calls. And I guess it's this kind of thing where you get some good news and you just immediately want to sort of tell the world. I had this email and I read it, and then literally I thought, no, look, I'm just going to call. I'm going to call him, and so I immediately rang him and said, look, have you seen the email? Have you seen the email? And he hadn't. I think he was out walking somewhere, and sort of demanded that he looked at this email because I was just so excited. And I think we knew relatively soon after reading that email that the whole direction of this project was much bigger than we'd originally thought. But just the fact that this stuff exists, I mean, I'm still kind of in shock. But I knew on that day that it could be something very special, but even then I didn't actually understand quite how amazing it was. But
it is amazing. And I think one of the things that amazes me is that, I mean, okay, so it's not something multi-generational that's been dubbed 1,000 times and looks like, when you go to YouTube and it gives you the different options, like of how you can, what quality you can stream it in, and sometimes it's down to like 101 or 200 something. And, you're like, this is the worst possible quality of something that I've ever seen. That's the kind of context in which we've seen most of these images. So to see that footage that crystal clear and that size was astonishing. And I have to say, the stuff that awed me the most, and obviously you didn't have any new footage from, as I understand it, anything that was actually shot in space. All of the footage was, as you said, the footage of the Saturn V on the pad, footage of the astronauts suiting up, entering the capsule, these sorts of things. You'd think, oh, okay, so they don't really have like new footage of the best stuff. But that's not how it plays. I mean, it is so inspirational, just even watching that sort of footage that it doesn't bother you at all. I mean, it's astonishing just watching people suit up and climb into rockets and stuff like that, because the footage is just so absolutely revolutionary.
Yeah, I mean, a bit of background on this. I was actually involved 10 years ago in the re-release of a classic 1970 film called Moonwalk 1. So this was, NASA had basically hired quite an avant-garde director called Theo Kameka, who worked for a company called the Francis Thompson Company, who specialized in these sort of large format films. And he'd done a really sort of niche, what became quite a cult film that was not the kind of the official NASA film about Apollo 11. And this had a lot of the very famous shots of the crew walking out, some of the suiting up shots, the crowds on the launch day, etc. So, and then the film was kind of forgotten about. But I had always been under the impression that the source material for that film had been destroyed due to some information we found at the National Archives. And so when we got this news that the 70 mil, 65 mil material existed, my first thought was, well, could it be the source material for Moonwalk 1? And the answer was yes, it was. But then also it was all this other stuff that we didn't know about as well. So the Moonwalk 1 stuff is some of the most amazing cinematography I've ever seen, which is the spectators at the launch site, the suiting. Actually, the suiting up was, I think, was filmed by a NASA cameraman. But they hired the best camera guys at the time to work on that film. And all we'd ever seen until that point was literally what made it into that final edit of Moonwalk 1. And even then, it had been cropped from this super widescreen format into 4:3.
Such a shame.
So no one. So it was this whole thing of, well, most of this stuff we hadn't seen before, but even what we had seen before had never been seen like this, because it had been cropped. And as you say, when other films have used it, that they would use something that had gone down about 5 generations.
Did you get your audio footage then from Ben? Like, where did you do your work? Were you sprinting from NASA HQ in DC and then down to Texas and then down to Florida? Like, were you popping between NASA facilities, tracking stuff down, or did you have stuff sent to you?
Well, most of the actual on-site research happened at the National Archives in Maryland, in College Park. And I spent a good month there in the summer of 2017, just as we said before, cataloging all this stuff, working out where the best sources of reels were likely to be, and then also by that stage going through all the shot lists which we'd found for the 65mm stuff. And just again, to go back to these sort of wow moments, I remember going on a short vacation to San Diego after this trip, and I was sat in a cafe on the beach, and I first looked through these shot lists of these are very detailed, explaining, wide shot Saturn V, aerial Saturn V, CU close up, Armstrong suiting up, and it was just like I could see in my head then what this was going to be like, because it was scenes that I was familiar with, but I was familiar with them in shot on 16mm, and it's like this is an alternate angle of the same scene shot on an IMAX camera, effectively. So that was very exciting.
In terms of the scope of what you've done and the work you've contributed to, I've read it's more than 1,200 pages of the Apollo 11 flight journal transcripts.
Yes.
And your name comes up in that quite frequently.
Right.
So you are definitely, you are living in NASA posterity.
Yes, I mean, I should sort of give a shout out to David Woods, who created the Apollo Flight Journal. He actually lives in Glasgow in Scotland, so another Brit, although...
I noticed that just because the transcript has quite a few UK spelling preferences. Yeah, and now he's done an absolutely amazing job. So, and he's been working on this for a lot longer than me. So I obviously am perfectly happy for them to use my work and make it available to other researchers. But we wouldn't be able to do the work that we've done without the work of people like David and of course Ben. And so I feel like it's a sort of standing on the shoulders of giants exercise, in that as we go forward, we can improve the historical record a bit more based on what's gone before. So basically, how long did the project take? How long was production? How were you involved from? It sounds like you were involved from the very beginning. Like, how long did you work on this?
Well, it was. We started the research in January 2017 because the Last Steps film premiered in October 2016. So it was shortly after that finished that we started on the Apollo 11 project, and then we were still working on it right up until just before the Sundance premiere, which was January 2019. So it's a 2-year project, basically.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, NASA's archives and the amount of material you've heard it said, we've talked about, tens of thousands of hours of video and audio material. There is so much stuff here. And so as someone who is slightly familiar, I've worked on a number of documentaries in which I've had to work with NASA to get material and go through material. It is an overwhelming amount of stuff in the best way, but still overwhelming. So the fact that you guys put something this great together in like 2 years may to some people sound like a long time. To me, it does not at all. You guys did an amazing job in a really short amount of time.
Well, yes, but as I said, like back to the Apollo Flight Journal thing, we can rely on that previous body of research, and then also my previous body of research, having already done the some of the Apollo synchronization, and then obviously we had all the 30 track to work with, and I could do a lot more of that subsequently for the film. But the basic principle was the same as when I'd done it before. So it was like riding a bicycle again after a few years of not doing it. So
it's like that old it's like the old Jurassic Park tagline, like 4 million years in the making or something like that. Like, this is the same sort of thing. It may have been 2 years of actual like production work, but basically it was actually many years more, because everything you've worked on previously in your life has already been building toward this.
Yes, but also I would say, I mean, actually, for example, Todd Miller had done an amazing documentary called Dinosaur 13 about an ancient dinosaur discovery that was or a discovery of a dinosaur fossil that there was a lot of controversy over. He can go into more details, I'm sure, but the his filmmaking skills and also the skills of people like Matt Morton, who was the composer, who just did such an amazing job.
I've been listening to that score for weeks.
Yes, it's they had really cut their teeth on previous projects as well. So you're absolutely right that it doesn't seem like a very long time, but a lot of expertise has gone into this, from the whole team from before, years of being in dark rooms, basically. Well, certainly in my case.
Yeah. You know, I was the research coordinator on Cosmos, a Spacetime Odyssey, and my job every day was to come to work, open up the scripts, break all the scripts down into like individual components that we needed to film, and then sit down daily with like our various science advisors or our history advisors, learn everything I could about what the script was describing in that particular moment, and then take that information and then sit down with the visual effects department or the animation department and say, here's what a black hole would look like. Here's how you need to depict it realistically, or here's what Isaac Newton's hair should look like. Here's what his shoe should look like. Here's what the streets of London should look like. Here's what the carriage he's riding in should look like. So basically my job every day was to come to work and learn, and then teach other people what I just learned, which is an amazing job. Have you ever felt that way about like your work? Like you just get to come to work and just be exposed to some of the coolest information out there?
Yes, it's a real privilege. And especially when you get to go to places like the National Archives or the Johnson Space Center, and when you're also meeting people who've made history. Like I was fortunate enough to be introduced to Gene Kranz, the flight director, recently, and it was just got to show him my work, and it was just a really, really humbling experience, because I don't consider us as heroes here. These guys are the real heroes who did this, and so it's kind of bringing that to life for a new generation and showing what they did. And keeping it for posterity. That's how I see it. But yes, it's a thrill. It's I don't see it as a real job. It's people working in hospitals and on the beat or whatever. That's a real job. Not I'm just playing around with space footage.
What was your favorite thing? Is there a single favorite thing in all of your research that you came across, a single favorite piece of archive material that you found that you still just kind of like hold up as this was my favorite thing I discovered on this program?
That is a tough one. I mean, it would probably come back to the sort of synchronization. I think, for example, there's a bit where Gene Kranz actually says "go for landing," and it's the real call, "go for landing," and I synced the audio with the footage of him saying that, and that was very special, because it felt like a very historical kind of moment in the flight that we can now sort of bring to life. So that's one of my favorites, but also some of the quieter moments as well, where the guys are kind of almost sort of talking off mic, or well, not off mic because they're obviously on mic, but it's you're kind of seeing behind the curtain in a way.
There's probably more than you can count. I mean, the whole thing was probably in some ways just a cavalcade of incredible experiences and observations and nuggets.
Yeah, I like there's a scene in the film with the Lunar Liftoff, and I really like all that where they're taking off from the moon. And I don't really think that had ever been seen before, because I think people hadn't really bothered to get that kind of material transferred from that scene. It would just be, you'd see the flag go up and you'd hear Nixon speak, and then we're on the way home and in the Pacific recovery. So bringing drama into that scene, I think, was a great achievement of Todd and the composers, and being able to see the guys in Mission Control reacting to that. That's one of my favorite scenes in the film.
I know for me and for many of my friends that I've spoken to who've seen the film, some of our favorite parts were the fact that Todd made the editorial decision to hold on those shots. And so rather than like intercutting with different things, if it's like I believe he keeps it's several minutes of the descent, and he films almost the entire ascent from the moon's surface with just the single camera, and you just hear the entire audio the entire time, and you really start living that moment. It has a certain amount of honesty and authenticity that you wouldn't get if you were editing it down into a much shorter piece.
Yeah, and I think that a problem I found with I'm not going to name specific films, but I think a lot of when people have tried to tell this story before, that they just get too keen to cut away to different shots. There isn't a kind of feeling that we should just let this thing breathe. It's like we have to show Neil Armstrong saying there's one small step for man, and then they would cut to a shot of the boot print immediately. Which isn't even Neil Armstrong's boot print, because I think it's Buzz Aldrin's boot print, but I'm sure you know the shot I'm talking about. So that Todd had that restraint to just let the thing breathe and let it run for 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah. You just mentioned some unnamed documentaries that you think handled things maybe not so well. Were there any documentaries that you continually watch, or that you watched before this, or what are some of your favorite documentaries aside from Apollo 11 that kind of inspired you?
Well, there's an all archive film about a Formula One driver called Ayrton Senna called Senna, which is kind of, I see that as a benchmark for archival storytelling. That he was a Brazilian driver, he was the best driver in the world, and he was in Formula One for 10 years, and he died in 1994 in a crash during a race. And this film just told his entire career through the Formula One, well, not just the Formula One archives, but other archives. But they had access to that Formula One archive, probably in the same way that we had access to the NASA archive for Apollo 11, that same level of... Whereas that in some ways was more difficult because of the commercial aspects of getting access to that. But just I say the way that it's edited, like a fiction film almost, but it's all real footage. That was that's a big inspiration for me, I think. In terms of space documentaries, there was a film called For All Mankind in 1989, which took a similar approach to what we've done with Apollo 11, but it was more. It had interviews with the astronauts, and it used footage from all the 6 landings to kind of create a super mission.
So as someone who's spent a lot of time in archives looking and listening to and watching various scientists and astronauts and cosmonauts and stuff like that, do you have any favorites? Do you have any people that you've spent time with in an, I assume, archival way more than physically that you find really fascinating?
Astronauts, you're saying, or scientists, or
astronauts? It just, the kind of people that you come across in your work, the characters that you are spending so much time with. Do you have any favorites?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult question. I mean, all of the astronauts are fascinating in their own way. I got to know Gene Cernan a bit through my work on The Last Man on the Moon, and he was a very interesting guy. I tend to not have met. I mean, people maybe imagine that I would have met lots of astronauts, and it's not really the case. I know them through the archive. But
well, right, that's what I mean. You've spent time with them in a darkened room, like you were talking about.
Yes. Who do I think? I'm really sorry. I don't have a specific question to specific answer.
If you're anything like me, I'm the kind of guy who. As soon as you say name your top 5 favorite films, and I'm always the guy who my brain just stops.
Yeah, exactly.
As soon as you ask me those kinds of questions, I have those answers, but not when you ask me.
John Czarnecki, who was the main scientist on the Huygens surface science package, who was the focus of Destination Titan, he became a very good friend of mine, and it obviously all began when I was at college in that room watching him on that stream. And he was always a fascinating character and just a really enthusiastic, someone who cared a lot about science and communicating that to people. And that obviously came across that day and came across when I got to know him. And yeah, so a while since I've seen him, I need to give him a call. If you're listening, John, then hi. I'd love to hear from you.
So the reason I ask that is because I have, in my career working in mostly science documentaries, I have had the pleasure and honor of spending a lot of time interviewing or in the presence of astronauts and scientists, and working on Cosmos. I've known Neil deGrasse Tyson for years, and the amount, like I always tell people, you spend 5 minutes with Neil and you are convinced you can do astrophysics. You can't, of course, because it's profoundly difficult. But Neil has a way of explaining really complex subjects that you actually walk away thinking you can do it. And that is something amazing. That is what separates the truly greats from others who are completely competent and even perhaps experts in what they do. But the ability to communicate that to others, the ability to light inspirational fires within others is, I think, what separates so many people.
Yes.
That's just an amazing
And I
thing.
found that Carl Sagan, obviously I didn't watch him. I was about 8 or 9 when he died, but I think he had that style from what I can see.
Absolutely did. I can still watch the original Cosmos and end up in tears.
Yes, it's I know I have watched that. Yeah, that was very good. I mean, David Attenborough in the UK would be another example.
Absolutely.
Of someone
Absolutely. He's both a national and a global treasure.
Yeah, it's. Sorry. I mean, actually, I can think of someone else. James Burke, who was the BBC presenter.
Absolutely, connections.
Precisely, yes. He did some great work on the Apollo program. In fact, he used to present all the BBC's live coverage. He was kind of our world's chronicle, but unfortunately, the BBC then went and wiped a lot of his stuff. So.
Connections is still one of my absolute favorite science shows I've ever watched. And just even recently, just in the last couple of years, I discovered that somebody had put them all on YouTube, and I actually downloaded them all and rewatched them all. It is his work. He's just one of the most inspirational science journalists, presenters I've ever seen. Professionally and personally, for me, Ben, a profoundly influential mentor in my life. Who are some of the mentors in your life and your career that have really kind of shaped what you do and how you do it?
Oh God, that is a difficult question. Well, I'd say that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. There's no one person who I would go to and say. Sorry, I'm doing that thing, aren't I?
No,
what's your favorite film?
I understand.
Who's my mentor? I mean, the thing is, I'm very kind of self-taught in some ways. Mm-hmm. So I don't feel like there's one person who said, you must sort of follow, like in a way you asked me what is an archive producer. I think it's an evolving thing. It's whatever I choose it to be, really, that role. So
you've invented your own path. That's actually
I mean that's not true. I think with the space stuff, it's a very specific thing. Who's a big influence? I'm really sorry. I'm blanking on this. I can't think of anyone specifically.
We can keep going, and if you think of someone, you can add it, and we can edit it right into this spot, and no one will be the wiser. I'll ask you some more interesting questions. So who is Stephen Slater when he's not at work? What are your interests in your off time? What is your favorite movie? What's some music you like?
Do people really care about my personal life? I don't know. I'm a very big music fan. I love the Beatles. I like Britpop sort of music, guitar music, and I'm a big fan of pop music as well. And I can see that I'd be interested in working on some kind of music documentary, because that's not something I've ever done before. So I'm it's hard to separate my professional and personal life because I do it because I enjoy doing it. So I wouldn't say that I don't have a huge life outside of space research, really. I follow, I enjoy watching certain sports. I just say I like learning things or learning new stories, or particularly when something comes up that I didn't know about. And that's why, I mean, we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the moon landings, and I get so many emails from people, producers mainly, saying that they want to try and do something definitive. I hate that word, that definitive. We want to do a definitive story of Apollo 11 or something for Apollo. And I always think, well, can't you just find a really specific thing you want to tell a story about, and then let's do that, rather than like the lunar module's propulsion system. There's probably a whole documentary you could make about that. I just picked that out, plucked that out of thin air. But it's I tend to be more wedded to those kind of things than something. Well, I suppose in a way we're talking at cross purposes a bit, because you've done Cosmos, which is the story of the life, universe, and everything. But I think, as you will appreciate, working on that, it's very, very hard trying to do something that has such a huge scope. And you've done it well, obviously, but a lot of people try and fail.
I love, by the way, that you just combined Cosmos with Hitchhiker's Guide for the Galaxy. Well done.
In what way did I do that?
You said life, the universe, and everything.
Right. Okay. That was subconscious. I wasn't thinking of.
I love it. It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect.
One thing I just wanted to ask Stephen before we wrap up here, and Brandon, you can probably have some insight here as well, is, when you guys work as researchers, and you get, kind of like an inspiration to look at something in a very deep way. Do you guys look at it from a technical standpoint, or are you guys looking at it in how the story can be told?
Well, I'm always, the story is always the most important thing. It's you could have the best footage in the world, and it's so if we take the mission control stuff, for example, it's always in the back of my mind was, well, how the reason for doing this is so that it can be used in a storytelling capacity. It's not just so I can geek out over the actual being able to sync the stuff together. It's like, I actually want to see this brought to life for a new audience. So yeah, it's I'd say definitely that, rather than the technical stuff.
It's funny, I was about to say, Cosmos, which was now 7 whatever years ago, was the last thing on which I was a researcher. I've gone on to become a director and a producer and a writer, and then it kind of hit me, even as you're just saying all of this, that's not actually technically true, because as a writer and as a producer, all you're doing is researching these sorts of things to find stories. If you're making something like The Story of God and you want to talk about how different cultures across planet Earth deal with the afterlife, you are researching all kinds of things to try to find people and elements of stories to tell. And same, of course, with, when we're working on something through the wormhole episode or something like that, in which we're talking about spatial anomalies of one sort or another, you, of course, have to go seek out the best possible stories and people and whatnot. So in many ways, the research aspect doesn't change. And I would absolutely agree with Stephen that story absolutely comes first. And 90% or more of what I do is discovering those amazing stories and then just being like, how do I fit this in? Or you think you have your story already, you've mapped it out, you've done an outline, you've got your everything set up, and then you discover some extraordinary story that completely slicks the entire thing, and you start from zero because you discover a better story, a different story, or half of everything we do is discovering something completely new blowing our brains out of both of our ear holes in pure excitement and excitedly kind of reworking because you can't believe what you just found. And then you can't believe no one's, knows this already, and you can't wait to bring it to them.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think the obviously in Apollo 11, that moment is the discovery of the 70mm material. It just takes it in a completely different direction. I mean, it would be very interesting to know what kind of film would have been made had we not found that stuff. I mean, I'm sure it would have still been interesting. It just wouldn't have been the same. Do you know what I mean? I like those kind of old, well, in your sphere, parallel universes. That's a good way of looking at it.
Well, yeah, in a different timeline, what would Apollo 11 have looked like had you not discovered the 70mm footage?
Yes, or if let's say one person wasn't on the team, wasn't working on it, or do you know what I mean? It's a kind of, but then you could look at it another way, which is a sort of. I obviously don't actually believe in this kind of thing, but it's almost like a destiny sort of thing that somehow this film was supposed to be like this and supposed to be made. But of course, that's not true. It just feels like that sometimes, that we would, this was inevitable somehow. But
I agree. I think you and I are on the same opinion in terms of destiny and divine providence and all of these sorts of things. But the difference is it feels like that because the project is so exceptional, or because the end product is so exceptional. And it's so exceptional not because of some sort of divine hand moving things. It's because the right people happen to find each other on the right project and happen to stumble upon the right material to tell a story. And it's the thing that separates truly great documentaries that we're going to be talking about for decades to come and mediocre ones that we'll forget a week after we saw them. That's the difference.
Yes, and I think also maybe there's some perception that this 70mm stuff just appeared miraculously to us, and I don't believe that's the case at all. I think the reason that we found it is because we asked the right questions, and people don't ask the right questions a lot of the time. And one reason a lot of archive is not found is because people just don't ask. People wrongly assume that everything is out there, and almost. Often that's not the case. Well, in this case, it wasn't true at all. But anyway.
Yeah, no, I think what I was kind of, and this is, a perfect segue to what I was going to ask next. One of the things that struck me about the documentary Apollo 11 is just simply that there wasn't a lot of hard cutting. You were able to immerse yourself in those scenes. Like, from what I understand, the first thing you guys saw was the crawler scene that opens the film. And that is just a stupendous, you don't have to say a word. It just communicates the massive undertaking, not only from just simply the technical side of it, the engineering and the audacity of trying to fly to the moon, which is like a dream of humans, is to visit another world. But it's going to happen because people are making it manifest. But through the filmmaking of just holding that shot, and like you say, it was this particular filmmaker that had the foresight to use those high-end cameras, and those things were huge to be, those things are like the size of suitcases that they're holding in the 60s. And I take that back. From what I understand, wasn't some of that stuff shot from helicopters? And they because of the size of the cameras, they just couldn't just slug them around like we do with a GoPro.
Yeah, they were. It was. That was I wasn't in the room at the time, but that was the first 70mm material that the team ever saw. Was the crawler on the way to the pad, and it was actually the image was upside down because the film had been bewound, and they. I think everyone's jaw was just on the floor when they saw that. But we carefully selected. I was before that. I was asked, and there was a consultation process. Okay, if we're going to pick 3 reels to do tests with, which reels are we going to pick? And so I had the shot list, and we looked at the shot list, and we were like, okay, we want the suiting up, we want some crawler shots, and we want the launch. And so that's how we ended up doing those first. But it's interesting that, as you say, Mike, they are in the final. That's how the film starts. So maybe Todd, and you'd have to speak to him about this, but he was so blown away by what he'd seen that day that it stuck with him that this was how the film needed to start. But it was natural. Obviously, it's natural that you would start with the crawler, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think the impact was so incredible. And I remember as a young kid being on that tour at the Cape Kennedy when I saw Apollo 11 launch, was the fact that it was so massive. And then we would, you actually witness the launch, and it's miles away and you can still see it. And of course, film does it justice now because you guys found that high quality, but I think you guys nailed it as a collaborative effort, the taste and feel of being there, because I remember feeling the earth shake of that launch. And you don't forget it as a kid, because when you're a kid, that's like, gold. It's like being in a candy shop. But the thing is that you guys really had a really good sense of the feel of it and the vibe of it. And I think that just speaks to, the passion of the filmmaking. And of course, if filmmaking is anything when it's at its best, it is that ability to tell stories. Stephen, thank you so much, man. It's just been wonderful to talk to you again. Hope the next time you come to America, we can hang out.
It was
some
great.
more.
I had such a good time. It was great. It was we. Brandon, I'm sure Mike mentioned, but we were at South by Southwest, so we got to hang out quite a bit there. So
I heard he showed you a good time in Texas.
Yeah. Archivist dream, going to another library.
We went to the LBJ library. But I tell you what, this would be such an interesting topic for a podcast. I discovered this after I got back, but there's a place where they have the first ever in-camera photograph in Austin. It's in a museum there. It's and it was taken in 1826 or 1827 by this French guy called Nietzsche. It's the earliest surviving photograph. So I'm annoyed we didn't get to see that.
That's crazy. Yeah, I mean, and I never knew of that, because Brandon, had you ever heard of that?
I have not.
Man, well, I think Stephen is provided a little image at his social media, so maybe we can get you guys. It's really really cool.
Thought of something that was a very big influence for me. There were, in the late 90s, the BBC did a 6-part series called The Planet. Now, I don't know whether you've ever seen that, but it was.
I have not only seen it, but I worked for James Younger, who was one of the writer and producers of that. I worked for him on a number of shows.
It's superb.
It absolutely is,
and it's a kind of TV I want to see more of. And I was, how old would I have been? 12, 13 at the time. It was very influential for me to sit and see that and how they would structure those episodes. And I don't. Yeah, it's immaculately researched, and it does feel like it is a kind of definitive piece, and I think it's so hard to do that. And now, I get calls from people saying we want to do something definitive in time for the anniversary, which is in 3 months or something. And it's I know that they spent 2 years researching that. So good things do not happen quickly, but. So I've kind of lost my train of thought a bit here, but I think if you're going to attempt to do something like that, you have to do it well. Otherwise, yes. you fail.
I think one of my favorite things about The Planets was how it covered the Russian side of the space race. I don't know how British history covers these sorts of things, but Americans understand the space race. They know that we were going against the Reds, going against the Ruskies, but we know next to nothing over here about what Russia was doing on that side. Yeah, you can mention Sputnik. We know what kicked it off. But after that, like, there's a dearth of understanding of what was going on the other side of that race. And one of the things that I loved about The Planets is it did an amazing job of kind of opening that door and illuminating the amazing stories and things that were going on the other side of the lane in that racetrack.
Yeah, it's very American and Russian centric, that show, and which it should be, because they were the key players. A lot of the unmanned stuff they cover in that with the well, I suppose it's mainly unmanned. There is an episode that deals with the moon, but it's very much more focused on the Russian side and on the science side than the usual. We choose to go to the moon fair.
Right. So, can you tell us what you're working on next? What's in your future?
I'm dealing with a huge backlog of requests for assistance with documentaries for the 50th anniversary, and it's just a case of trying to work out what I have time to help with. So that's on my desk a lot, and then hopefully moving away to do some projects that are not to do with space, because I kind of feel like I need a bit of a break from it. But I'm not saying that I won't come back to that or won't be. I suppose it's kind of inevitable that people are always going to ask me about Apollo 11 or about my archive work in that regard. But there are other stories to tell that I want to do. I don't have anything specific. I think something music. I'm very interested in music, and I think that might be where I'd go next. But who knows? We just don't know. There's nothing.
That sounds brilliant.
Specific.
I
will let you know as soon as I know.
Well, I think we will be following your career. Is there anything else in the future that would you like to get back to directing again, making your own film again?
Absolutely, I would, and I do have some ideas, but I think it would be, again, something like Destination Titan, where it's a really quite a small film, and it would only have a small number of contributors, and I could sort of do it at my own pace. That's what I'm into. And in-depth archive research, because I think I think we've only scratched the surface of what we can do with archive, and there's a lot of education, ways that people can be educated about using archive that I want to be a part of, actually. So I think the teaching aspect of it is something that appeals to me, and talks and things, although I need to be better at I'm not great at standing in front of an audience, so need to brush up on those skills possibly. I hope I haven't been rambled on too much today. It's not something that comes usually naturally to me. So
not at all. And if anything, Apollo 11 is proof of exactly what you were talking about, that you can tell extraordinary stories, you can reduce people to tears about something that everyone has already very familiar with and has already even seen, if told spectacularly well, because of the sort of work and the caliber of work that people like you put into it. So thank you so much for your amazing work that you've done. Thank you so much for sitting down and talking to us today, and best of luck going forward with whatever you do. And I can't wait to see what that is going to be.
No, that's great. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for having me. And I hope people got something out of it. Sorry, that's not a very good sign off, is it?
Well, if they didn't, I'm sure Mike and I did.
Brandon, what an incredible interview. I don't even know where to begin. It's such a stupendous film. What was your impressions of talking with Stephen? Besides the fact that the dude is just laser focused on the space program, it's clearly an obsession.
You know what? I think walking away from that interview, one of the biggest things that I was kind of hit with is the magic that is created from people who do things that most of us don't find remotely magical. And what I mean by that is his job is probably for many people very tedious. He's, like he said, he sits in a dark room and he pores over documents and he pores over audio feeds. He's got tens of thousands of hours of stuff that he has to go through. And that sounds to most of us to be horrible. But what do he and his colleagues produce at the end of that? They distill all that down into this elixir that is the Apollo 11 film. And I was just speaking to someone just this morning who said she watched that movie and just wept throughout the entire movie just because of the overwhelming awe of the experience. And that awe is the result of years of the sort of hard, tedious work that Stephen and others have done.
Yeah, I think what I wasn't quite aware of was how many other film projects that he was a part of that prepared him for this kind of culmination into what I would call a historical document that will be looked at 1,000 years from now. I think if everything else is gone in the apocalypse that is in our future, perhaps, that if anything survives, I really hope it's that one film, because it seems to communicate universally, and it's not something that we have to be told what's happening. We can just look at that film and just get it.
Well, and you know what? It's not the first Apollo 11 or Apollo documentary ever been made, and it's not even the only great one. There are many others that are also phenomenal. The difference, I think, between this one and those is that this one actually did something for history. It actually took the puzzle pieces they found and actually connected them in ways that had never been connected before, matching that audio to the video, finding new video that none of us had ever seen before, that sort of stuff. That is actually adding to history. That is building it. It is adding musculature to a story we thought we knew entirely, but we didn't. And for that reason alone, this thing is going to stand the test of time, because it isn't merely entertaining or inspiring. It is actually enriching the history of those events.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think the accomplishment of the film is that it communicates visually in a moment from the beginning moments of the film, and certainly holds that tension throughout. I don't think there's sometimes when you watch films, we put and of course you've worked as a film critic, you put your criticism hat on and you start looking for things that are weaknesses. And I really thought about it, and I thought, well, as a documentary experience, I couldn't find any weak links. Was there anything at all that bugged you about it, or were you just kind of like hoping that it would go longer and you could see more of it?
I would have. It could have been multiple hours longer, and I would have been just as more blissfully happy. Yeah, no, I didn't find any weaknesses in it. I was not concerned. I was interested going in, knowing that there was no narration, knowing that there were no interviews, that everything was going to be told only using source footage, only using source audio. And so that was so as someone who's worked and written for documentaries myself, I wanted to see how that was going to be pulled off. And because, again, going back to Stephen, because of the sorts of things he found, he was able to fill in every little paving stone, every little touching stone along the way to tell the entire story from start to finish with no missing pieces.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And, we can certainly watch the film again when it's released on, hopefully Netflix or at the very least, whatever the new physical medium that is available, because I always want to see those behind the scenes aspects of these projects, because I'll be really interested, because I heard something about the film that they were seeing for the first time, these 70 millimeter films that the types of cameras or projectors rather that they were using don't physically touch the film. They are controlled by airflow so that they don't damage the original artifact.
Fascinating.
And that's
because those artifacts are so old and have been sitting in boxes for decades.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. So I'm going to be looking forward at the nuts and bolts of that, and I'm sure we'll learn more as the year progresses. Because of course, this is the year of the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 expedition. Maybe in closing, Brandon, what is your most memorable space expedition? Is it Apollo 11? Is it Apollo 13? Is it one of the shuttle missions, or maybe it's one of the robotic probes? Which one stands out to you as your favorite, at least for this week?
In terms of what humans have done, nothing comes close to Apollo 11. For me, Apollo 11 is not only quite possibly the greatest human achievement in the entire sweep of history of human habitation on planet Earth. It is also, for me, something more. It is a symbol of what human beings can do when they come together in the interest of science and exploration and innovation and engineering to build something as incredible as they did in so short a time. That is what humans are capable of doing. That is that we should be celebrating, the insane hubris. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in the best possible way. We are humans. This is what we can do. And when we get down and when we get despondent and when we look at the maelstrom of our current lives and everything that is going wrong, we can look to this as a prime sort of like tentpole of history and say, this is what we are capable of. Let's get back to doing things like that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, for me personally, Apollo 11 is certainly that one human event that is singular in nature. And, I really hope that some of the other people that are really screaming and yelling for a manned Mars mission, that would probably be the next type of exploration planning, and perhaps it'll be comparable, and it'll be a very different thing because the magnitude of that will be exponentially even more difficult. So I'm looking forward to when that happens, and hopefully you and I will live to see it.
100%. Yeah, I completely agree. That would be the next major, it like you said, and technically speaking, it would be exponentially more difficult and more impressive than even landing on the moon. It would perhaps be a little less so in the human consciousness merely because it is the second time humans have visited another planetoid. But can we ever tire of what that means, of what that kind of accomplishment indicates? That's hint. No, we should not.
Yeah, we'll have to call Andy Weir up one of these days and see what he has to say about that particular mission and what it might mean for the human race. And of course,
I think Andy would say, "Bring potatoes."
That's right. Bring potatoes and keep the science real. Yeah, disco lives. All right, Brandon, this is great, man. We will catch you on the other side. Thanks for doing the interview for me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, sir.
My name is Mike Dawson. I am producer, music composer, and host of Dreamers2Makers. I want to thank Stephen Slater for being on the podcast today. And I want to congratulate Brandon Fibbs for conducting the first interview of the Dreamers2Makers second season. I encourage all of you to check out Fibbs' own podcast, Wikisurfer. All my music you heard today can be found at my band's website, roarelectra.com, or at roarelectra.bandcamp.com. You can find my Dreamers2Makers podcast anywhere podcasts are found, and at Dreamers2Makers home at assignmentuniverse.com. Stay tuned for more news about the podcast and other projects. But for now, goodbye, old friends. See you next time.